The All Aboard podcast is back this week with episode 45, where we talk about the aftermath of the Norfolk Southern Ancora proxy fight and what's next for the Thoroughbred of Transportation. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice-weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B. PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who may hopefully one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And even though we're 12 hours late, it is always great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, I want to tell you, the reality is Penn Central hasn't taken over this railroad, and we're not running things completely off schedule. But unfortunately, last week, I unexpectedly lost my job, and it's very sad because I had a great opportunity to help railroading in that capacity. We were able to fight some great things, like oppose the crew size mandate that the current administration is trying to impose on the railroads. Weren't quite successful there, but it was something that was very important that we fought, because that certainly is going to impact the future of the rail industry. And the same goes to the effort by the California Air Resources Board, better known as CARB, that was seeking to impose California's own rules on locomotive emissions, which most certainly would have balkanized the rail system and made it next to impossible to operate an interstate railroad network. So a lot of that work was terrific, and probably one of the highlights was actually getting thrown out of Senator J.D. Vance's office for opposing the Railway Safety Act of 2023, which is terrible legislation. And even though I supported Senator Vance didn't seem to take too kindly to me opposing his bad bill. But again, I am a big believer that railroading is the most important industry we have here in the United States, and not just because I love trains, but also because it is critical to everything we do, all of the goods, and not to mention our ability to get from place to place. So I'm glad to have done that work. I'm sad that went away, and most importantly, I'm also sad that my railfan window, because we were located right next to Washington Union Station's yard area, so I got to see everything that Amtrak, MARC, and Virginia Railway Express threw at it, not to mention your occasional Norfolk Southern locomotive that came in leading a disabled Amtrak train, or CSX's office car special. It was amazing, but it's going to benefit you because a lot of the pictures are going to be out on allthingstrains.com as part of the Tower K Gallery. If you are looking to use the photos in a project you're doing, whether we're talking about your website or a publication or otherwise, we'll license it to you for very little, but just a little, because we got to keep this train on the rails. But we'll also have them available if you want to use it on your background, or if you're a National Railroad Historical Society, museum, nonprofit, and they could fit into something that you're doing, we'll make sure to get you that for free. So just keep a lookout at allthingstrains.com. And since I have just a little bit more time in my hands now, you will see a little bit more happening there. So ultimately, I think you, as this great community that follows us here at the All Aboard podcast, are going to benefit from that. So now on to the main event. We are talking about the long-running Norfolk Southern Ancora proxy fight, which came to a head last Thursday, May 9th, when the shareholder meeting was held, and the result was 3 of the 7 proposed Ancora directors were elected to the Norfolk Southern board. And for those of you who are on CP5 Cam, let's see if we can get some of them on the screen for you. Now, the first is Sama Fami, and here he is. This is his LinkedIn page. Now, he most recently departed from CPKC, having come over from the Kansas City Southern. Now, he had previously worked with Amtrak, CN, CSX, and the Association of American Railroads. That's over a very long career, which dates back to the 1970s. And some of his work was actually technology related. So that's very interesting that they did manage to get somebody with a technical background as part of the board of directors, information technology related. And why that's significant is we know ever since the Conrail division of 1999, how critically important that information technology is to railroads. In fact, we could go all the way back to 1968 with the Penn Central merger to know how important information technology, knowing where cars are, and having the ability to interact with your customers and provide them data, not to mention getting the data that you need for your accounting purposes. So having somebody like that, I think, is going to be a very good addition to the board because he is bringing a very, very extensive resume in that regard to the board. And of course, he was proposed by Ancora. The next that we want to highlight is Gil Lamphere. He's the gentleman on the top. Now, he is the chairman of what's called Mid-Rail, but that name actually harkens back to the 1980s because he was one of the people, the prime movers, you should say, behind Mid-South. And of course, Mid-South was an extensive network in the southeastern United States. It was largely comprised of spun-off Illinois Central trackage. Now, Mid-South, of course, was eventually sold to the Kansas City Southern, and that led to a lot of arrangements, including the Meridian Speedway, because that was some of that was former Mid-South traffic that combined with KCS trackage combined with KCS trackage, and then partnering with Norfolk Southern was able to get Norfolk Southern traffic out into the Dallas-Fort Worth area directly. And so, of course, NS invested in the Meridian Speedway, as did Kansas City Southern, to upgrade the routes and make that a more viable route. Now, anecdotally, we haven't seen all that much promise based on the press releases there. But anyway, this is something that Gil Lamphere did have a role in helping create. Now, Mid-Rail is very interesting because what they're looking to do is acquire short lines as well as industrial railroad privatization. So that is something that they're going to be on the outlook for. It'll be interesting to see what that does to Norfolk Southern overall, if that ends up leading to more short line trackage spinoffs, if you see short lines expanding, because what is interesting is Mr. Lamphere, in addition to what he did with Mid-South, he is very much a financial person. He's worked in private equity and investment banking and so on. So he will be bringing that kind of entrepreneurial mindset and short line mindset to the Norfolk Southern board. And of course, he was yet another Ancora nominee. And the last of the Ancora nominees that made it to the board is William Clyburn. And William Clyburn is related to Jim Clyburn, who was most recently House Majority Whip under Nancy Pelosi when Democrats were in charge there. There's Mr. Clyburn. But his rail experience actually goes back to the late 1990s when he was appointed by President Clinton to the Surface Transportation Board, and he served there from 1998 through 2001. So that gives you a little idea about the three people who were put on from Ancora. Now, there were two other people who ended up joining the board of directors, and we've covered them previously, but we'll go back. First of all, we've got Richard Anderson, and you probably remember him if you've been an Amtrak passenger. He was, between 2017 and 2020, the CEO of Amtrak, and he followed, not only did he follow Wick Moorman, but he was also the person who, I guess you could say, worked very closely with the current CEO, Stephen Gardner, who was then the chief operating officer. And a lot of the changes that many people have, of course, lamented about Amtrak, including the infamous "let's get rid of the dining cars" effort started under Mr. Anderson's tenure. And then you also have Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who was a Democrat that served from North Dakota, and there is Senator Heitkamp. She will also be joining the board of directors. So you have three people from Ancora who joined, and two people who were appointed by Norfolk Southern's management to come to the company. Now, I want to stop for a quick second here and give you a short message by NS CEO Alan Shaw. So we will get that up on the screen, and this is just their message to employees after the proxy fight was over. And here we go. Now, of course, we'll get you right through that ad. And we're hoping one day that we don't have to deal with that, but until we do, here is Mr. Shaw.
I know each of you has been eagerly awaiting the results of our shareholder vote and our annual meeting. It was a good day for Norfolk Southern. What our shareholders did and how they voted indicated their confidence in our strategy and our approach and our management team. But they were also really clear They want us to deliver results. We've got 5 new board members, 2 of whom were nominated by Norfolk Southern. I've already reached out to all of our board members and pledged to work with them on delivering the best results for Norfolk Southern. We're completely aligned.
And I think that, and that's a snippet of it. We'll have the full video linked in the description here for this episode, but that gives you an idea that, you know, it does look like there is going to be effort for detente on the board. And I think with the backgrounds of the 3 rail-aligned people that Ancora did elect to the board, that you are going to see a very collaborative process among them. After all, number one, this a good railroad contingent overall, especially when you include Mr. Anderson, as well as Claude Mongeau, who has already been serving on the board and was the former chief executive officer of Canadian National. So that's a positive. Also, what I think you'll see is that because Ancora does not have a controlling stake in the company, or they're not kind of at parity with some of the larger shareholders, that you're not going to see the level of I guess you can say vitriol that was coming out during the proxy fight, and that we'll cover a little bit more as this episode unfolds. Now, here are some of the other noteworthy aspects of that. First of all, Jim Barber, who was Ancora's pick to be CEO, was not elected. Now, I thought that was going to be kind of interesting if Barber did end up serving, because on one hand, he was the former CEO of a major customer of Norfolk Southern, and I thought that could be a very, very big benefit to the company, because it would not only be able to cultivate closer relationships with UPS. Now, we're not talking about him being able to just simply call up UPS and say, hey, let's get a deal done. But a lot of the people, maybe even below the C level, that he would have had an opportunity to work with, and he knows he would be able to utilize his network to work more collaboratively. So I think that could have been a positive. On the other hand, though, Barber was looking to become CEO of the company, and that would mean you'd basically have a CEO in waiting, sitting right there watching the current CEO, Alan Shaw. And as you know, that is never, ever a very helpful way to do any kind of business, because that means one person is always looking over his shoulder at a competitor, as opposed to working together with the board and the top managers to execute the company's strategy. So I think it's a wash on Mr. Barber's non-election to the board. Also, this shows that, at least not in the near term, will we see Jamie Boychuk, who is Ancora's pick to be Chief Operating Officer of Norfolk Southern. It will remain John Orr, who came over recently from CPKC, having been on the Kansas City Southern, but having spent 34 years with Canadian National, including under Claude Mongeau and also E. Hunter Harrison. And of course, we mentioned Harrison because Harrison was seen as the godfather of precision scheduled railroading, and that both Ancora and the Norfolk Southern management pledged to implement some version of PSR, with Ancora being a little bit more aggressive in what they were proposing, as opposed to Norfolk Southern's approach, which was going to be more of a PSR with qualifications. So I think we're going to see a little bit of that. Now, some of the rail industry press has been very interesting in the way they've covered it. I haven't seen much in the way of opinion pieces from Trains, Railfan and Railroader, or even Progressive Railroading yet. Now, in the lead up, if you follow Trains Magazine's podcast, they did have Bill Stevens on to talk about the proxy fight just before it took place, and you could definitely tell that Bill Stevens was certainly on the side of management. Whereas, here at the All Aboard podcast, we're trying to take a little bit more of a down the center view, but that's also because I didn't see anything that told me that either side was proposing anything that was going to be radical. But the most outspoken has been Railway Age, and they said, quote, Ancora's aggressive tactics seemingly backfired badly on them, even amongst those inclined to be natural allies. Perhaps it is no significance that fellow activists such as Edgepoint Investment Group, which holds a 2% stake in Norfolk Southern, abruptly severed cooperation with Ancora after initially entering into a cooperation agreement. They added, quote, with this reckless slash-and-burn style, no wonder some Wall Street analysts are beginning to treat Ancora as an inconsequential gadfly. And, of course, we'll have that article, which is entitled Norfolk Southern Pulling Out of the Station after proxy fight, leaving activist Ancora in the dust. No question on the slant there. We'll have that in the description so you can read for yourself. But they did bring up some interesting points. Ancora was very aggressive in how they attacked Norfolk Southern's management and the information that Norfolk Southern provided to the public. I think, though, that there were a lot, because railroading is a very small industry, a lot of people who were taken aback by how aggressive they were. But the reality is that proxy fights are very aggressive. You are always going to have a lot of mudslinging, and it really is up to the outsider, the activist, to go out and say, hey, management is a bunch of bums and they're terrible and you need to throw them out, especially when that activist does not have a controlling stake or a close to controlling stake in the company that's being, that they're attempting to force change. And if you look back at some activists, prominent activists in the past, and the one that I know best is T. Boone Pickens, because I did a lot of reading about what he was doing to try to shake up the oil industry during the 1980s, it always is tough. So I actually, judging by that lens, I don't think this was overly aggressive or that they were over the top. However, I do think it was notable in that this proxy fight took place very much in the media, and so therefore, whereas a lot of people, average Joes, might tend to ignore proxy fights because this was everywhere. You're talking about your CNBC, and then of course hobby magazines like Trains and so on. It was very difficult for this to simply be something that ends up going on quietly among a relatively small group of business leaders and investors. And I think that is really what made it seem like Ancora was much, much more aggressive than they really were. And by the way, one need go back no further than Robert R. Young and the New York Central and the fights that he had, not only with New York Central management over a couple of decades, but also with the Interstate Commerce Commission and with the rail industry in general, to find out that an activist investor most certainly will never, ever be a shrinking violet, somebody that comes in and politely taps you on the shoulder and says, but hey, I think we could add some value here. It always starts with teeth, and the teeth just get sharper. Now, the question is, what is next? Now, Norfolk Southern, like the article said, they're leaving the station, and it's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle. Now, for a little statistical analysis here, during the first quarter of 2024, the company's operating ratio was 92.9. Now, I want you to think about that. So for every dollar, the Norfolk Southern, the railway itself, which is a subsidiary of Norfolk Southern Corporation, which is a holding company, for every dollar that NS bought in during Q1 of 2024, 92.9 cents of that went out the door for expenses. So this gives you an idea. This is actually going right back to the bad old days of railroading in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, before the impact of deregulation came along, when you saw railroads that had operating ratios that were this high. Now, what's really interesting, as I perused the Q1 10Q report, and each company, for those who are not regular followers of publicly traded companies, each publicly traded company will issue a 10Q, which is a quarterly report that talks about their operations and financial results. They are not as voluminous as the annual report, which is called the 10K. 10Qs and 10Ks are very good reading if you're going to follow a railroad closely, whether you're a fan, an employee, or an investor, or a public policymaker. And that's because while those documents tend to be fairly dense, and they also tend to be just infested with legalese that they're trying to, obscure a lot, they also are very telling in how management is looking at the operation, and they can and sometimes be unusually candid. And what I found interesting about the 10Q, where they reported the operating ratio of 92.9, is that they've also started to put in adjusted EBITDA and adjusted numbers that do not conform to GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting principles. Now, I know you're probably wondering, hey, Phil, listen, I love trains. Why are you talking to me about accounting and all this other stuff that seems to be kind of boring? Well, the reason why it matters is we've been seeing that a lot in a variety of industries that are looking for ways to put out better numbers. And so to me, anytime I see a company that is putting out numbers and they're showing that it's adjusted, that is kind of a way that is more or less saying, well, look, you know what? We want you to be able to focus on this aspect of the operation or that aspect of the operation. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not maligning Norfolk Southern management, nor am I saying that they are running a bad railway or anything of the sort. I think that they actually are very competent and they have good people there who understand the network and they understand what the job is. And I think you're going to see a lot of that as you go forward. But what is noteworthy is when you are doing that focus, it does seem to indicate that perhaps the problems are a little bit deeper than we have seen, or even that Ancora was able to point out. I think there is a longer road to getting Norfolk Southern back to the very regimented, profitable, or highly profitable, because the company is profitable, but highly profitable company that in the 1990s was looking to become a dominant force for transportation in the Southeast, and then of course the Southeast as well as the Northeast. There is a lot more to do. Now, I don't think you can point the finger at any one person or any one decision, because that's generally not how companies work, but it is safe to say that every enterprise, good, bad, small, large, you name it, will have a drift from its principles. And I think that since the Mormon era concluded, you had a little bit of a drift at Norfolk Southern, and there was a lot that happened. You had the positive train control change, you had a variety of things that take place, and a lot of things that can distract management. So I think Alan Shaw and his team recognize that there is going to be a lot that they have to do to get the NS back to its historical levels in terms of operating ratio and financial management. That operating ratio that we just mentioned was 20% higher than it was in the first quarter of 2023, when it was 77.3. Now, what's also noteworthy, Q1 railway operating revenues were down by 4%, and then expenses went up by 15%. Now, taking a little bit deeper, except for the metals and construction materials segment, every traffic group they have is down. So metals and construction up 8%, which is good, but coal is down by 10%, and most alarmingly, intermodal is down by 8%. And now when you look at this on a revenue per unit basis, so that is for every container or truck trailer that was shipped, that intermodal revenue per unit is down 15%. And almost every traffic group is down on that measure too. And so that shows you that, especially when it comes to intermodal, which NS is looking to make the centerpiece of its network, having revenue per unit, so per container or trailer, go down by 15% is striking. That is something they're going to have to work very hard to change. And then having the traffic volume go down by 8% as well is a little bit of an issue that they're going to have to go to. So I've weaved some opinion in here, and I'll add a little bit more what I think. So first of all, as far as Ancora is concerned, although most people have looked at that as being a smackdown because they didn't get everything they wanted, I think they've had some level of success. So first of all, there are 5 new board members, and the 2 board members, so Richard Anderson and Heidi Heitkamp, that Norfolk Southern nominated and that were elected, that was partially in response to what Ancora was doing. So you have these 5 board members, so that's just about a little less than 40% of the board is now new. 3 Ancora nominees, 2 Norfolk Southern management nominees. Now, between Claude Monjou, Same Fahmy, Gil Lamphere, and also John Orr, the chief operating officer, who's not on the board, you have a substantial background in the precision scheduled railroading model that that really grew at Illinois Central and Canadian National. So that means you're going to have a lot more of that focus on scheduling car movements and having a service plan for each car, as well as longer trains. Now, we know that longer trains is something that's become a point of regulatory scrutiny, but that's going to be there. And I think you're going to have increased efforts at making asset utilization even higher than you might have had at Norfolk Southern in days of old, when you consider that all of these people who were part of the E. Hunter Harrison orbit, or I should say the Hunter Harrison Gil Lamphere orbit, for many years, they were part of that. And I think you're going to see a greater level of that at Norfolk Southern. Now, I do think that Ancora took things a little too personally. and that's probably because they're based in Ohio, in Cleveland, and the East Palestine disaster was not very far from them, and so that might have been a little bit of just extra oomph for them to say, okay, well, look, if this was just a, let's say, beverage maker that was located in Colorado, well, yeah, they may not like the financial performance. They may think it's a good activist target, but they're not energized to do as much because it's not in their community. And of course, seeing a lot of that and the overly exaggerated way that the media went after Norfolk Southern for really following a set of established procedures and doing what they could to save lives and property, and successfully doing so, I might add, is something that I think really stoked that fire. So I think had you seen Ancora be going after another entity that wasn't associated with that you might have seen them be a little bit more disciplined in their results. Now, another thing that I think posed a problem for Ancora is that Norfolk Southern in many ways is a fairly stable company with respect to corporate activity. Now, if you follow the Wall Street Journal, you follow CNBC, Yahoo Finance, and the like, you hear a lot of times companies doing spinoffs, mergers, acquisitions, you name it, up and down. But Norfolk Southern has been relatively stable in avoiding most of that. Now, it did, of course, make a big acquisition with 58% of Conrail in 1999, but since then, it's been relatively quiet, with the only thing that they really did after that buying a portion of the Delaware and Hudson, the D&H South, which is how they now operate up as far as Albany. Now, they did some deals with Pan Am Railways, which is how we had the Pan Am Southern, that when Pan Am / Guilford Transportation Industries was still around, was the majority of the former Boston and Maine route across Massachusetts between the Albany area into the Boston area, and that is how NS got to New England, or got directly into New England. And you also saw the aforementioned Meridian Speedway, what they did there with the Kansas City Southern, and then working with state and local governments as well as the federal government on the project to the Heartland Corridor project, that enhanced a number of their lines with public funds. But what they didn't do is either go for the big acquisition or engage in a lot of spinoffs, even when we're talking about things like the Pocahontas Land Company and so forth that they owned that were part of their system. So I think the fact they had relative stability made investors a little bit less willing to go ahead and throw in with an activist. Now, by contrast, one of the big activist stories was Canadian Pacific, when Mantle Ridge, which is led by Paul Hilal, formerly of Pershing Square, and who worked with Bill Ackman. When Pershing Square, it wasn't Mantle Ridge, it was Pershing Square, got involved with Canadian Pacific. Canadian Pacific, the railway, had been spun off from Canadian Pacific Limited, and so it was a relatively newer independent company after having been part of a different enterprise, Canadian Pacific Limited, which had hotels and steamships and at one point an airline for a long time. So I think that, probably had a different philosophy with the way that investors would look at an activist coming in and pressing for change at a company. Now, I also think that Ancora struggled because they didn't have a great difference in terms of their plan than the Norfolk Southern plan. Norfolk Southern said, well, look, we're going to put elements of PSR in. We recognize that we've got a problem. And Ancora's plan was, we're going to put PSR in just at a higher level than you. And quite frankly, today in time, it is much more difficult to say, well, I'm going to do the same thing as you. I'm just going to do it a little bit bigger. Because most people in general aren't looking at that as being a very good choice. And I think that is yet another thing that held Ancora back in their pursuit of Norfolk Southern. And finally, they only own 1.75% of NS. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. After all, Mantle Ridge, who I was speaking of before erroneously, Mantle Ridge is the one that went after CSX, and they were the one that put E. Hunter Harrison in the CEO's chair there. They owned approximately 1% of CSX when they did that. However, they were able to work a little bit more collaboratively with the other shareholders and with the company, not to mention the fact I think Michael Ward by that point was getting a little bit closer to when he needed to retire because he had been in charge since 2003 in some form, leading the company. So that made it much easier to do there. But if you only have 1.75%, it does get to be a much bigger job to convince other investors, many of whom are passive investors, just as Ancora's leader did point out during the shareholder meeting. And so that makes it just a little tougher. And so therefore, my approach would have been to purchase 1.75 to 2% of the company and then use swaps and other contracts to effectively control a larger block, even if you didn't directly, but give you the option to take control, direct control of that larger block under certain circumstances if necessary. And so that was a little bit of a strategic misstep on their side. Now, I don't think, though, that Ancora is through. I think they will be closely monitoring what the company does. And I do think that they are going to watch those 10Ks and 10Q reports very closely, as well as the Surface Transportation Board's reports on rail service, including dwell time and cars on the system and so on, all of which they have, which will also be linked in the description, to see how NS is doing. After all, they are a substantial shareholder in the company, even if it is relatively small in terms of the overall float or the number of shares outstanding. And I do, though, think that Norfolk Southern, under Alan Shaw and the rest of the management team, John Orr and so forth, will have an opportunity to do exactly what Mr. Shaw said in that video, which is to deliver some returns and drive growth. Whether we actually see that happen remains to be seen. However, they are a competent group that very much can get the job done. And as rail enthusiasts, we certainly hope that does happen, because a healthy Norfolk Southern certainly supports a healthy CSX, healthy Canadian Pacific, CPKC, Canadian National, BNSF, and all the short lines, and so on. And certainly, for those of us who are fans, the healthier the railroads are, the more likely they are to get involved in some of the things that we want to see, like steam engines and so on. So if you want to see the 611 and any of these other steam engines back on the Norfolk Southern main line, you definitely should hope that Mr. Shaw does well and the rest of his team to get that company moving again. So we will be back tomorrow with our next episode on time, on actual time, not Penn Central time. But thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for being part of the audience. And we will see you on the main line tomorrow.